Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I am brown. That is how I wanted to begin this podcast. I am brown, not white. Now, I realize that racial categories are entirely socially constructed. As a retired sociology professor, I used to lecture that to my students all the time. And sometimes the things I would say would be surprising to them, such as why not have races based on hair color or eye color? Certainly you find variability in hair color and eye color regionally. But the reason why we have the racial system we have, at least here in the US, is because of slavery. So first, we had the black slaves, and then there was no need for the term white. Eventually, as more categories became added to black, there was a need to distinguish Europeans, people of European ancestry, from those others, and so the term black emerged. I'm not black. My ancestry is not African. My ancestry is Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish, most recently Middle European Jewish, going further back to the Near East. But I am certainly not white based upon the categories that I define as being important. Again, Arabs are generally called brown. They, like me, are Semitic. So why am I called white? It is not that I am trying to look for some logic in race. There is no logic in race. It's purely arbitrary. Racial categories are based on power, especially economic power, but other kinds of power as well. Gradually, throughout American history, as different ethnicities gained more power, they gained the label white. So my father, when he was a child, was not white. He was Jewish. When he returned from World War II, he was suddenly white. Similar experiences can be found with Italians, with Irish, and others. They were not white at the turn of the 20th century. Now they are. And basically, the same thing happened after World War II, when the assimilation was recognized and there appeared to be no justifiable reason not to include Jews, Italians, and Irish under the generalized umbrella of whiteness. But why? To me, calling myself white is damaging. It is literally as if I am damaging my Arab and especially my Palestinian sisters and brothers. I don't want to be distinguished from them. There's too much separation in the world today. I want to be like them, not like the Zionists. Most Jews I have known throughout my life have been comfortable with the term white. My parents were too. Do I think they really gave it much thought? No, but they accepted it. When I was younger, I accepted it too. It just did not cross my mind why I should not use that name. It wasn't until later, after getting my Ph.D., that I began to think that, gee, why am I called white? Why? Why? There's no reason for it. I am called white because, as a Jewish person now, I am now privileged. Jews in general in the US are relatively privileged. Not as privileged as Episcopalians, but privileged nonetheless. Now, are all Jews privileged in the US? Certainly not. And I am not even from a privileged background myself that much. I am from a working class background. But nonetheless, I have that white label attached to me. And so when I go into a store, I am not followed around. I don't have to worry about a police officer stopping me as I'm driving down the street and potentially shooting me. I don't have to consider about a Jew's lives matter because there's no need for it. Black lives matter, yes. Jews' lives matter, that would be foolish. The purpose of Black Lives Matter is an assertion of the fact that police commonly harass people of color. I remember in my frequent trips to the Deep South when I was a young teenager, not realizing that I would end up living in the South for so long, that old Black men, primarily, sometimes old Black women, would address me as sir. I was 14 years old, 15 years old. I was astonished, but I literally did not know what to say. No one had ever called me sir before. I was not entitled to it based on my age, or so I thought. But not so in the Deep South. In addition, very commonly, when I was walking down the street, if a Black person was on that street, she or he would cross the street to avoid passing me directly. It was then that I realized, if not in words, at least in attitude, that I truly was privileged. I was privileged. I had advantages that people of color did not have. And the older I got, the more I began to despise those advantages. Today, despise would not even be a sufficient verb for it. I find them to be horrendously offensive. Do I say anything? No, because I realize when someone is calling me white, they are simply following custom. I suppose I look white. Now, when I look at myself in the mirror, I don't look white to me. To me, I look Jewish. Now, I could see how somebody who was not from a part of the US where there were a lot of Jews might mistake me for, say, an Anglo person. But here, that is what happens. Here, in the Rio Grande Valley, there, in Macon, Georgia, in Athens, Georgia, there, in Starkville, Mississippi, there in Wise, Virginia. I don't blame them. There were almost no Jews where they lived. They had no basis for thinking of me as anything else. They had no idea what Jews looked like. But again, looking into the mirror, gazing into the looking glass, I realize that I do not look white. If white is defined as Anglo, that is. I look like an Ashkenazi Jew. Very much so. I have many of the facial features that many of the people I grew up with who were also Ashkenazi Jews also had. The only reason I don't have a bump on my nose, I don't think I've ever told anybody this. I had a deviated septum. It was caused by an accident. I was in a park. A friend of mine was playing Frisbee. The Frisbee went in the wrong direction and hit me across the nose and gave me a deviated septum. During the surgery, the surgeon hit my nose right over here. I guess he thought he was doing me a favor. I did not pay for that. And he eliminated the bump on my nose. So I no longer have that bump. But I did. I did. I did. I did have that characteristic Jewish bump on my upper nose as a kid. It went away when I was having surgery at 20 years old. The bump was simply gone. I immediately recognized it. But I don't think I told anybody, not even my parents. I suppose I wasn't sure what to say. Mom, Dad, I have no bump on my nose anymore. My mother had a very self-evident bump. My father had one, but not as evident. Mine was evident, but it's not there anymore. It's gone. So here in the Rio Grande Valley, where I am called an Anglo, even though I have no English ancestry at all, the absence of that bump on my nose reinforces the idea that I am Anglo, that I am white, even though in my view I am not. Again, I say this as someone who recognizes, who affirms the social constructedness of race. I know it is socially constructed. I know it is not real. I know it is simply an accident of history, basically an accident of bigotry and prejudice, if one could call that an accident. But nonetheless, given the realities of the time in which we live, given the fact that the term brown has now risen to prominence, it's a relatively new term, and it's become a very encompassing term as well. It includes a lot of people that are now considered to be brown. So why aren't I among them? I'm not. At least not in the way in which brown has been defined. But I should be. And so, although I would never correct anyone who called me white, I think that would be extremely inappropriate, even rude. Because I realize that in calling me that, they don't mean any harm by it. They're not trying to offend me, obviously. And by responding negatively, I might present an image of someone who was hurt, which I'm not really hurt by it. I expect it after being called white my entire life. How could I not expect it? That has been my racial label since I was a child. I have always been white. Even though I grew up in two Jewish neighborhoods in New York City, one in the Bronx and the other in Queens. Still, all of us called ourselves white. That term by then had become so reinforced. It was just so common. Nobody thought of it otherwise. Nobody even questioned it or asked, why are we white? But I think now, considering that Arabs, as well as a lot of other people, are called brown people, I have a right to assert in this podcast that I am brown. I would not take it beyond this podcast, because then it could be seen that I was being offensive, and the last thing I want to do is to offend anyone. But in a podcast like this, I can make the point. And my counsel, although I have no right to give anybody counsel, to be honest, I really don't. But I'll use that word anyway. I couldn't think of any other word. My counsel is that Jews, Ashkenazi Jews in general, regard themselves as being brown. Not that you go out and blast it to the world. That's kind of silly. There's no point in making such a fuss. And that would probably cause more problems than it solves. No point in that. But if I were having a conversation with an Arab, and right now in my life, I don't know any Arabs. I have earlier in my life, but not now. And I doubt there are that many Arabs here in deep South Texas, 2 miles north of Reynosa, Mexico. I doubt it. How in the world would there be? This is not an area that would attract a significant Arab population. But I imagine there are some. I have yet to meet them, or if I have met them, I didn't know that they were Arabs. So if I were to meet you, if you are an Arab, I would happily, joyfully, enthusiastically affirm that I was a brown person too. One final note. The anti-Arab sentiment in the Jewish community has been around for a long time, even though Jews and Arabs generally get along quite well in the US. Still, when I was growing up, I literally thought that Arab was a four-letter word. Well, of course, literally, it is a four-letter word, but you get my point. I thought it was an insult, like the K word for Jews or the N word for blacks. Yeah, that's what I thought Arab was. I honestly believe that. Why? Because whenever I would hear discussions of Arabs, it was always in a negative way. Despite the fact that Jews and Arabs interpersonally got along fine, when discussed as a category, Arabs were always looked at pejoratively, always. in my life anyway. So now, I hope that there are some Arabs watching this podcast. I hope. I hope. If you are, know that I consider myself to be an Arab like you, in a sense, or a Jew like you, or an Arab like me, or a Jew like me. That's my point. We are all Semites. We are all Semites. Whether we call ourselves Arabs or Jews makes no real difference. We come from the same family. My dentist in Kansas was a Palestinian woman, a wonderful Palestinian woman, a brilliant Palestinian woman. If I didn't know better, I would have thought that she were Jewish. She had the bump on the nose. She looked Jewish. Well, really, she looked Semitic, like me, or like I did before my nose surgery. So I hope that this podcast has made some sense. The fact that I want to collapse the barriers between Jews and Arabs. If I can call myself a Jew, then I can call myself an Arab. If you can call yourself an Arab, you can also call yourself a Jew. We are both Semites. We are both Semites. And we deserve to be together. We deserve to be living in what Roy Bhaskar called co-presence. I guess the unfortunate thing is that Jews in this world are generally first worlders, whereas Arabs are more commonly third worlders. That is a definite barrier. Maybe that is part of why Arabs are not seen as being white. I don't know. But regardless of the reason, I want to make it clear to you that although I will never make a big deal out of it for obvious reasons, I am a Semite. I am a brown person, just as you are. If you are an Arab or a Jew. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.